Okay, so it's rumpled British writers with unlikely hair part 2.
The rehairing. Well, I'm sure you all know who this man is. If we were to run through absolutely everything you've done, we might get time for 2 minutes of questions before the cleaners come in. But at this point in your career, I mean, you're a novelist, writer, screenwriter, lyricist. Is there a particular medium that you feel most at home in, or are you a free-ranging hen?
You know, that there isn't actually anything I feel at home in, which is
Ever.
probably good. Stops and thinks for a moment. No, I feel like a fraud.
Right.
And I feel like a fraud in just lots and lots of different things. I love writing children's fiction, but I know that I'm not really a children's fiction writer. I'm just somebody who creeps in and writes a children's book every now and again, then runs away. I've just written my first book for really tiny kids, which actually came about rather peculiarly when I was in China, and I realized, talking to the Chinese, that none of my picture books were in print in mainland China.
Right.
They were in print in Taiwan and Hong Kong, but in mainland China, these picture books, which are in print all over the world, things like The Day I Swapped My Dad for 2 Goldfish, or The Wolves in the Walls, are not published because they are considered socially wrong.
Right.
Children do terrible things like swap their fathers for goldfish and are not punished for them. And you know, there may be a slightly dodgy point of view of the family as being properly sacred and stuff like that. And so I thought, right, what I have to do is write a picture book that is so cute that the Chinese will publish it without realizing that it is socially dangerous. So I have written a book called Choose Day, CHU''S, about a baby panda who sneezes. And because I thought there is absolutely nothing in the world that is cuter than a baby, you know, it's goes up to 11 on the cuteness meter. And so it's about a baby panda who sneezes. And terrible things happen when he sneezes. And he causes huge amounts of devastation. And then everybody puts him to bed, and he's very happy. And I figure that this is actually a book that I want 2-year-olds all over the world to be read, but especially in China.
Wonderful.
And then in 25 years, when the revolution comes, they'll go, "It was that book."
It was all your fault. I actually heard you say once that, you were discussing that you have these pockets of people who enjoy a certain area of your work and maybe not others. And I'm sure there are people here tonight who've read absolutely everything you've written. But at that time you said that of everything that you've done, that the thing that you hope that people don't bypass is the writing for children. Is that still something that you feel?
Well, no, what I was saying, I think, was something similar to that, but not quite the same. What I was saying was, you do not know what posterity is going to pick up on. And you don't know what you will be remembered for. You really don't. You create art, you throw it at a wall. The most obvious example would be someone like A.A. Milne, who in his time was considered both the greatest comedic writer for adults that English had produced in short form. He was the superstar of Punch. He was a playwright, and an incredibly successful West End playwright. At one point, he had 5 plays on in the West End simultaneously, which was practically unheard of. And had you told him that 50 years later, if you wanted to do a Google search or an Amazon.com search for things of his that were in print, all you would find would be thousands and thousands of variations of the 2 books he wrote, 2 prose books and 2 poem books that he wrote for children. That's what he was remembered by, the Winnie the Pooh stuff and the poems. And I don't know that there's anything wrong with that. In truth, if you're talking about what you're going to be remembered for, just the idea that you are going to be remembered as some kind of artist or creator is unlikely and glorious. And the truth is that A.A. Milne, if you put him side by side with the other great humorous writers and great playwrights of 1929 and stuff, we wouldn't have heard of any of them.
Yeah.
And he actually has made something that lasted. So I certainly, if in 100 years' time, somebody turns to somebody else and says, I just found out, the guy who wrote The Day I Swapped My Dad for 2 Goldfish did other stuff too. I'd be cool with that.
Do you ever feel, though, that disappointed or maybe that's the wrong word, but that there are people who will perhaps read, say, Sandman or American Gods and maybe not experience other areas of your work just based on, I guess, what you would call genre prejudices?
No. I'm not, because I started out in comics. And the great thing about starting out in comics is every single possible prejudice that can be leveled at an area of the arts is leveled at you. You are not in the gutter. You look up at the people in the gutter with a sort of envious thing going, oh, what it must be like to be up there in that gutter. I want to be in that gutter one day. And that was really how I started. So every time, I'm always thrilled when people who discover me in one place discover me in another place. And I love it when people come up to me and they say, well, I've read everything that you've done. And I say, really? And they say, yeah, everything. And I say, well, Sandman? They say, well, I haven't read the comics.
Does that still happen?
Yeah, it still happens. And
right.
You go, well, no, you should read the comics too. They say, well, I don't like comics. You go, you'll like this. Just go read it. And the truth is, some of them will and some of them won't. But would I love it if everybody who liked anything I'd done liked everything I'd done? Well, of course I would, but I don't think that's ever going to happen anyway. And I never mind. It's a weird phenomena I've noticed of readers, that they get apologetic sometimes about really liking something. And people come up to me at a signing and say, well, I really like Stardust a lot. And you go, good, that's wonderful. I like it better than anything else you've done. That's great. I love that people have favorites. I love that they like things that I've done. I don't ever go, you should only like the last thing I did best. The only people I find myself ever getting grumpy at are the ones who just probably would really love something but don't read it, or the ones who assume that because they've read something I've done, everything else is exactly the same. And I know that's true of some authors. It's not true of me.
Yeah, I feel like in some ways your career has sort of been typified by a reluctance to cover the same ground again? Is that something that you consciously go about? Not repeating yourself, not reinventing things that you've touched on before?
Yeah, but it comes from two different places. One place was, I was a young journalist. And I used to interview a lot of writers as a young journalist. And one of the things that made me really sad I was 22, 23, 24, and talking to people who were household names. But they'd be household names writing one kind of thing. Detective fiction or science fiction or thrillers or whatever. And you'd talk to them, not during the interview, but normally when you go out for a meal afterwards or in the pub afterwards. And they'd start talking about, I've got this great French Revolution novel that nobody published. Or, a really good novel I've written about a riverboat race and the Mississippi, and nobody really wants it. And I'm going, but you're so-and-so. And they go, yeah, but I'm a crime writer, and it's not a crime novel. So there was definitely, even back then, the idea that I did not want ever to be pigeonholed as a writer who only did one thing. I wanted to, if I was going to be a writer, I had to be allowed to do whatever the next book was. So that was part of it. And I think the other part of it was Sandman, because I had a story to tell that actually took me the best part of 10 years to tell.
Yeah.
And having told one story for 10 years, I was then very much on let's see what else I can do. And, okay, I've done a Neverwhere novel. Could I do Neverwhere 2? Yes, I could. Will I one day? Maybe, I hope so. But in the meantime, I'll go and do this thing over here. I'm now planning in January, very nervously, to start writing something that at least when it starts out is going to be American Gods 2. And that it's not something I've actually sort of said anything about publicly, but I think we're so close to January now.
Yeah. It's pretty much tomorrow.
I'm probably allowed to say this. And a lot of that came out of doing a big reread back in February, March of this year of American Gods for the author's preferred text edition. And I went and I got the original manuscript out, and I got the copy-edited English version and the copy-edited American version I was going through. And as I was reading it, I started noticing all of the things that I'd done while I was writing it that were meant to plug into the next book, which I'd never written. And I started thinking, I find the idea of writing another American Gods book kind of scary. And that feels like a really good reason for doing it. Normally the reason why I don't go off and do the next book is because faced with the choice between, on the one hand, doing something that I've learned how to do, I know how to do, and that people are waiting for, and on the other hand, doing something I have no idea whether I can pull off or not and that nobody wants, I will always go for this hand. In the case of American Gods 2, I'm looking at it now going, I have no idea what I'd be doing. And that makes me I know things about it. I know more about it than anybody else. But I'd really like the idea of just sort of setting out on my own in the jungle and seeing what I produce.
Well, you said recently, it was a conversation that you had with Sean Tan, actually, and you said, I'll start any piece of art to find out what I think about something. I'm going to learn something I didn't know when I began. I'm going to discover how I feel and what I think about it during the process. Is that how you feel going into this?
I think that is. And I think it's why, and I think that for me is actually the fundamental, the key to why I've been this peculiar butterfly-like writer. Is I very, very rarely start out going, I have something big and important to say, I am going to say it.
Yeah.
I start out going, there's something about this that intrigues me, there's something about this that obsesses me, there's something about this that I think it's important for me to try and figure out. And maybe if I figure this out in fiction, I can articulate what I think. I didn't start writing Coraline to tell kids that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. Being brave means you're absolutely scared and you do the right thing anyway. But that was what I realized I was writing when I was 3/4 of the way through the book.
Yeah.
And because I realized that was the one thing that I wished somebody had told me when I was a kid, and I thought I was a coward. And I thought I was a coward because sometimes I was scared. And I would go, I wish I was brave. And there's that point where you go, no, brave doesn't mean you aren't scared. That just means you're not scared. Brave is a completely different thing, and absolutely, being terrified is an important component of being brave.
And I feel like being terrified is an important component of starting something creative too.
I think it is. If I know that I can do it, I probably won't do it. I'll just run it through in my head, go, yeah, I could do that.
Great. I'll write another book, whatever.
Yeah.
Write a TV show. Well, on that note, because I'm sure there is some questions bubbling in the audience, we've got some ushers around. You can see them. They've got big Wheeler Centre T-shirts on. And it's probably going to be easier if you've got a question to kind of make your way towards them.
Having attended Tom's reading, I want to say something before questions are asked. A question is a relatively short set of words ending in a question mark capable of being answered from the stage. If you feel the urge to tell us what you think about something, it's not a question.
And so, on that note, no pressure, but we're going to start up here on the balcony.
When I was 3 years old, Neil, you said earlier on that being a comics writer, you felt like you were looking up at the gutter. I was wondering, is that where the idea for Neverwhere came from? People looking up at the gutter?
Ah, what a lovely question. No, the idea... But it's a great question. The idea for Neverwhere began when I was on the judging committee of the Arthur C. Clarke Awards in England. And I was at this judging session as it finished, and it was being held in the Groucho Club in the UK. And it was over, and I walked over to the bar, and there was Lenny Henry, the English comedian and actor. And Lenny said, "Oh, Neil, I was going to get in touch with you anyway. How would you like to write a fantasy TV series?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And he said, "The only idea I have is, could we make it about tribes of homeless people in London?" And I went home and I thought about it, and then I wrote him a fax, because this was a long time ago, and that was what we did back in the dawn days. And I sent him a fax, and I said, "Look, I don't want to make it tribes of homeless people in London, because I could make it really cool to be homeless in London. And I don't want some kid whose uncle is abusing her in Liverpool to run off to London to live homeless on the streets because she's seen how cool it is on the telly. Let me take this over into the realm of metaphor and create an alternate London where the people who fall through the cracks go, and have our tribes of cool people live there." And Lenny went, "You're right." So that was how Neverwhere began. That was the genesis.
up in the cheap seats.
Are they significantly?
Rattle your jewellery.
That's not necessary.
Yeah, and they paid the same price for everyone else.
They're all in the same seat.
Unless they saw Tom Stoppard, in which place they will have paid.
They're all precious.
More overall, but less per gig. Yes.
It's all perspective. Neil, just an inquiry. I'm wondering where, if you're feeling, particularly at a creative low point, where you get your inspiration from to come up with such amazing tales and amazing subject matter to write your stories about?
What you've actually done there is ask the question that must not be asked of writers. You've rephrased it ever so slightly, but what you've fundamentally done is say, where do you get your ideas? And writers are awful to people who ask us where we get their ideas. We get mean. We don't just get mean, we get mean in a writery way, which means we'll make fun of you. And we do that.
I'm not afraid.
And the reason we do that is because we don't really know. And we're terrified the ideas will go away. So every writer I know has a funny answer. And you know, Harlan Ellison used to say that he got them from a little idea shop in Schenectady. I knew a writer who, when asked, would say he gets them from the Idea of the Month Club. And people go, really? He goes, oh yeah, every month they send you an idea. The truth is, I think, for me, inspiration comes from a bunch of places. Desperation, deadlines. A lot of times, ideas will turn up while you're doing something else. And most of all, I think ideas come from confluence. They come from two things flowing together. They come from essentially from daydreaming. It's that point, and I suspect it's something that every human being does. Writers tend to train themselves to notice when they've had an idea. It's not that they have any more ideas or get inspired more than anything else. We just notice when it happens a little bit more. But you're just thinking. You go, well, you know, everybody knows that if you get bitten by a werewolf, when the moon is full, you will turn into a wolf. You know that? There's that moment where you're sitting thinking, so what happens if a werewolf bites a goldfish? And or that moment where you start thinking, well, actually, what happens if a werewolf sinks its fangs into a chair? And what if you're sitting in that chair and the moonlight touches it and slowly it starts feeling more and more wolfish and then it growls and you know, and then what about the, oh my God, then you'd have to set it in the winter because you'd need the snow for people to try and figure out why you've got chair leg marks in the snow by the body that's had its throat ripped out, and suddenly you have a story. So that's... So a lot of it is daydreaming. I wish there was something... I always feel I'm in some ways disappointing people when they ask, where do you get your inspiration? Because what they really always want is the answer. They want you to be able to say, well, what you do is 11:58 at night, you go down to the cellar, you roll the goat bones, there'll be a banging on the door, it will open, this thing will fly in, it will explode, you'll have something like a chocolate, you eat it, you have an idea. I don't know, you make them up out of your head.
I'll come to you in the front row in a minute because we'll get you a mic, but first back there.
What was it like writing for Doctor Who, a show that's been on for almost 50 years with its own mythology?
It was awesome. It was wonderful. It was a dream come true. Every now and again, my wife reminds me how grumpy I would be every time I would get asked to rewrite that script, which occurred, I believe, 11 times over a period of about 2.5 years. I have completely forgotten this. You know, this must be like what it's like to sort of, have more than one baby, and you just go, no, I have this wonderful child. People go, don't you remember the pain? Oh, really? Was there pain? So, according to Amanda, I was really miserable whenever I would have to get back down into... I think I may have got particularly miserable and grumpy when my episode, which was meant to have been episode 11 of season 5, got bumped because they ran out of money. Very peculiar. The BBC, I did a commentary for my episode on the new DVDs that are released. So I was locked into a studio. I wasn't locked in. I could have got out any time I wanted. I was in a studio with the thing running, and I did a commentary. And I did my very best to talk the whole time. And I turned it on and started listening to it and discovered that there are long gaps in it, which is apparently anywhere that I referenced BBC budget problems as reasons why we did or did not do something. They carefully got in and edited out, and I'm now completely quiet and saying nothing about that. But they ran out of money, so my episode got bounced. The bouncing of it meant that, A, I had to change the tone very slightly, and B, I now had Rory. I had an extra character in it, so I had to rewrite an awful lot, because a two-hander suddenly became a three-hander. And I think I must have been incredibly grumpy. Now, all I do is look at it and go, it's so much better than it was that first draft. But I like it. It made me happy. Doctor Who is something that I had loved since I was about 3 years old. People talk about me and mythology, and they say, well, you really love mythology. And I say, yes, I do. But for me, Doctor Who was probably the first mythology. I remember, I knew where Daleks came from before I knew my Egyptian gods and my Norse gods. I knew about Skaro and the Thals, and I knew that Daleks couldn't see the colour red, and I worried about the red Daleks. I really did. In the Dalek World Annual, it said Daleks cannot see the colour red, and there'd be red Daleks. And you go, what are they seeing? Are they just seeing a collection of Dalek bumps floating in the air? And they're thinking it's ghosts. Oh my God, another Dalek bumps. What is that? I hope that answers your question.
I saw The Independent described a sequence in The Doctor's Wife as being like Event Horizon. Was that the worst thing anyone's ever said about your work?
There was some... the weirdest thing were... The one thing that I never expected to see were the comparisons to Beckett. And they'd say art. And about 4 people picked up on this in various sort of... And they were all respectable, broadsheet kind of things. And they said, well... reminiscent of Beckett. And I go, no, it's not. It may be a lot of things, but it is not reminiscent of Beckett. It's so weird doing The Doctor's Wife, because people say to me, well, was it fan fiction? And I said, well, of course it was fan fiction. This is something I've loved since I was 3. And I got to play in that sandbox. And not only did I get to play in the sandbox, but I actually got to do something subtly that changes the entire series for the previous 50 years. You can't quite watch it. Having seen The Doctor's Wife, if you see a previous episode of Doctor Who, you go, yes, that's the TARDIS. I know more about her than he does.
Show off.
Yeah. If you're going to do it, show off.
Now we've got... Can you speak up?
Yeah.
I can repeat it.
We'll repeat the question. Yeah.
I'm just curious as to how your creative process changes when you're writing something that's not entirely original, like Doctor Who or Batman, for instance. How does it change when you're not writing something that you've created yourself entirely?
He said, can you give me $50 to mend the shed?
So the question is, how does my creative process change when you're writing something that's completely original, just something where I'm making it up from scratch, and something where I'm working to some extent in somebody else's sandbox with somebody else's parameters? The example you gave was Doctor Who and Batman. Truthfully, I don't think it does change very much. And I don't think it changes because everything you do when you're making art is going to have rules and going to have parameters. If you decide to write a story set in Shakespearean times, you have a bunch of parameters suddenly. People are going to be talking in a certain way, dressing in a certain way, behaving in a certain way. And it's a way that fundamentally is going to be untrue to the time, but true to the fiction that you're creating. You're not actually setting out, if you're writing a Shakespearean thing, Shakespeare in Love, picking something at random written by Tom Stoppard, is essentially Shakespearean fan fiction. It's not actually saying this is what it was like. It's saying we are going to take a bunch of fundamentally 20th century tropes and traditions about acting and drama and the theatre and the stage, and then we're going to transpose them into Shakespeare's time, and then we're going to put on some hypotheticals along with that, and we're going to do all this, and it's going to be told on film, which means we have a certain budget, we have a certain number of scenes we can do, we have a certain number of people we can have and ways we can do it, and it can only be a certain length. It can't be 5 hours. You're always dealing with parameters and issues. So Doctor Who, frankly, has glorious parameters. The parameters of Doctor Who are, you've got something is going wrong. Somewhere in space and time, something is going wrong. And this blue box is going to turn up, and there's this bloke in it, and he will actually solve this problem somehow. Or die trying, and he might do that. It's okay, it won't be the first time. And those are your parameters with Doctor Who, which is pretty broad. With Batman, I was given an additional sort of odd parameter, which was, we'd like you to tell the last Batman story. And it was a very odd parameter because obviously it's not the last Batman story. Batman will, in some form or other, it may not be still published in paper, monthly, in a floppy periodical comic by the time that I die, but in some form or other, Batman will still be coming out, published by something that once was DC Comics, for all of my lifetime and all of yours and beyond. So here am I writing the last Batman story and trying to figure out a way that I can write the last Batman story that actually is going to be the last Batman story always. Whenever it happens, whenever you read it, you can always go, this will be the last Batman story. And then there are directions you can't go because Frank Miller's already done the Dark Knight Returns, so you can't really go that way. And I thought, okay, well then I'm going to tell the story of Batman's funeral. But because Batman is so many things, I'm going to see how many of those things I can put in. And whether I can tell that story and also make it art and make it work. And what I learned when I did that was I could do it for about half the people who read it. You know, it was a gloriously divisive comic. And you never know. Sometimes you do things that everybody likes. Sometimes you do things that some people like. Sometimes you do things that nobody likes. Sometimes you do things that nobody likes except you, and then you're not even sure if you still like it just because nobody else likes it, and you're the one going, no, I really like this thing. But in the case of that, you know, the feedback on it was 50% I thought it was a wank, and 50% people going, oh, I cried. And I was just pleased that it worked for the 50% that it worked for.
You guys.
Hi. I've heard around bits and snatches that you don't like your books to be taught or on curriculums, and academic criticism makes you a bit nervous. And as a teacher and academic, I'd love to hear straight from you.
Well,
why not?
I know that they're going to be. I just worry because I hate Thomas Hardy. I hate Thomas Hardy with a deep and fundamental passion that's practically cellular. And I'm also perfectly aware that Thomas Hardy is a really good writer, and that if I had found Thomas Hardy on my own, probably in my 20s, I would have gone, Thomas Hardy, what an interesting writer. That's such good books, such a fine evocation of the countryside and the people in it, and so on and so forth. And instead, I just remember being 14 and forced to read Far from the Madding Crowd and hating it. And hating Jude the Obscure more. And I just worry that... And then I remember going to the Amazon.com website, the page for Fahrenheit 451, and spending a fascinated afternoon reading the 1-star reviews, which were all from kids who had been forced to read Fahrenheit 451. And obviously, you know, there was obviously a trend in American schools for a brief while to actually tell kids they had to do their reviews and put them up on Amazon. So there were kids putting up reviews on Amazon about Fahrenheit 451 where they would tell you how they destroyed the book after reading it with pride. And I just never want to be one of those. Really, that's my whole thing. Is just I would so much rather that somebody would come to the books naturally and find them and go, interesting looking cover, and pick it up and love it, than that some kid who actually would have quite liked it if he'd found it, or she had found it naturally, hated me. So, there.
We've got another one up here.
Hi, I was just wondering... okay.
It's terrifying looking up here. I'm scared you'll fall.
So am I.
You can sit down if you want.
No, I'm right. I was just wondering, Death is a character that appears in your various works, and she's portrayed in a very different way than most depictions of Death as a character in literature. I was wondering how you came to portray her like the way you did.
It was a sort of essentially a sequence of thoughts. I had thought I was coming up with Sandman. I'd gone, okay, this is going to be Dream. He is going to be the human embodiment of Dream, as a, not even as a god, but as a sort of powerful primeval force. He is going to be Dream. And I sort of thought, well, he can't obviously be the only one of these things there is. And I sat down and was looking at quotations. I pulled out my big Bartlett's book of quotations and was just running my finger down and looking at a dream. And I saw a line somewhere that said, dream is the brother of death. And I thought, that's a lovely idea. Dream is the brother of death. I thought, if I did that, if I made death part of the family, then I actually have the natural sexism of language on my side. Because if I tell anybody that dream is death's younger brother, everybody who is reading it will naturally, due to the inherent sexism of language, simply casually assume that death is the older brother. It's how it will work. And I liked that. That gave me sort of something. When you're writing a monthly comic, any place where you know more than the reader is a wonderful thing. So I liked knowing that. And then I thought, well, what kind of death do I want? And I thought, well, really, when it happens to me, I do not want a skull-faced person with a scythe and an hourglass turning up to play chess with me. I do not want somebody on a black horse or whatever. I thought, what I want, on a pale horse, what I want is somebody who will say, you know, you really should look both ways before you cross that street. Who I'd like. And I thought, well, okay, so that's starting to form a person, just somebody fundamentally likable, somebody nice. And I also remembered a tale, I don't think it's in the Talmud, but it was some strange, obscure Jewish commentary, which said that the angel of death was created by God to be so beautiful that upon seeing the angel of death you would fall in love immediately, and so hard your soul will be sucked out of your body through your eyes. And that is how you die. And apart from the fact that I immediately started wondering about how blind people die, I thought that was beautiful, and I thought that was wonderful. I thought, yes, I like that. I like the idea of a death you can love. And that really was where death began. Just the kind of death that I'd like to meet. Somebody sensible, somebody nice.
We've got somebody there in a very nice hat.
Good evening, Neil. In The Kindly Ones, some years ago, you have a quote, and I have it here if necessary, on the aching, hideous vulnerability of love, and I was wondering what you thought about that, besides what you've already written.
It's such a funny quote, that. What I love about that quote is, one, of course, it's true. But two, I didn't say it. Rose Walker in The Kindly Ones said it. And the peculiar thing about that is I get to see that quote all over the internet. And now it's crept out beyond the internet. It turns up in books of quotations and things like that. And it's always attributed to me. And then I see people going, well, Gaiman has an astonishingly jaundiced view of love. And I go, no. A little bit of my head has an astonishingly jaundiced view of love. And a little bit of my head still has an absolutely romantic view of love. And the little bit of my head that has the jaundiced view of love was the bit that I gave to Rose Walker when she had her heart absolutely and utterly broken. And she got to talk about why she hates love, and how love takes hostages, and how love is all about vulnerability. And the strange thing is, I think that's all true, but I do not believe that is a reason not to love. I think the vulnerability of love, and the fact that it actually does, love does take hostages, that love actually means that suddenly, in many ways, you are weaker, because you have to care about somebody else as much as you care about, or more than you care about yourself. I think that's an empowering thing. I think it's a good thing. I think it's one of the things that makes me proud to be human. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I would still stand by that quote, but I would always try and attribute it to Rose Walker and not to me.
We've got another front row one down here.
Especially like going into American Gods 2 and Indirect. And I'm just wondering, you know more than you could tell us about someone?
Lovely question. For anybody who couldn't hear it, like the people way up at the back, the question was, I've said that, I do know things about characters that don't necessarily get into books, and have, could I say something? And the trouble is that when there are things that I know, I am author enough and parsimonious enough that I always go, well, maybe there's a chance that one day I'll need that. So it's like, could I tell you who the Endless's parents were? Well, of course I could. I've known that for 30 years. Almost 25 years. But I'm not going to tell you. Because one day I may need that. One day I may go back and do another story. So I tend to be, there's stuff that I know, but I don't think there's anything that I know that I might not one day want to tell as a story. So I'm not going to tell you about, why Tristan from Stardust took a balloon trip to hell, which he did. And in order to bring back the soul of an evil wizard who'd had somebody else's soul tattooed on his back, and it was now burning them. It's a story I know all about, but one day I might write it. So even telling you that, now I have to kill you all. Damn. We were getting on so well. Release the hounds. There are no hounds.
How well do you know your characters when you're writing? Do you come into a piece sometimes with a full biography behind a character, or do you get to know them as you're taking that journey through the narrative with them? Does it differ?
It differs. It differs from character to character. It's like names. Some characters turn up with names, and some characters don't. And the ones who turn up with names I love, because it means I don't have to worry about naming them. Characters who don't turn up with names, I will spend anything up to the next 3 or 4 years trying out every single name I run into, going, is he a James? No, he's not a James. And there are some characters where people go, oh, that was a crap name for that character. I go, you should have seen some of the ones I didn't use. So I love characters who turn up fully formed. I love characters who turn up and have a huge existence beyond the page. Some of them do. And some of them don't. Some of them are literally paper thin. I know nothing else about that character than what's on the page. And it's kind of weird. Some characters, this was especially true of Sandman. When I was writing Sandman, some characters would have lives that would continue off the page. And they'd go off stage, and they might be off stage for 30, 40 issues. But if you said to me, what's happening with that character, I could have told you.
Yeah.
Some of them went off stage, and I expected them to come back. Barbie, in the Game of You storyline, I expected to come back on. I kept preparing for her to come back on. I figured she'd come back and she'd be one of the characters in the Kindly Ones, because everybody who was in Sandman came back in the Kindly Ones, and she never came back. I've no idea what she was doing or what happened to her after she left at the end of Game of You. Her story was done for me.
I think one of the things people often say about writing, and don't worry, I will let other people ask questions, is that it's a lonely pursuit. That the idea of the writer is that you're in your garret. writing fiction, do you sometimes feel like you look forward to getting back to work because you get to hang out with those characters? Or am I revealing my own personal lunacy?
No, I think the only time that was true was during Sandman.
Right.
And during Sandman, it was absolutely true that I spent more time with those characters over that 8-9 year period than I did with anybody else, including members of my family. I would be with those people 8-9 hours a day, every day, and I knew them better than I knew anybody else, and that kind of thing. And honestly, I'm glad I didn't do it for 20 years, because I think that way lies madness. Occasionally I'll run into people who have written very, very long-running fictional things and spent more time with fictional people than they did with real people, and they definitely have problems sometimes with with knowing what's inside their head and what's outside. But writing is lonely. Writing is peculiarly lonely. I think one reason why I love doing comics, why I love occasionally going off and doing movies or TV, one reason why Amanda merely had to suggest that we could go on the road together, and I was so there doing an evening of reading to people and stuff like that, is because I am a social creature, and given the choice between dealing with people and being on my own in a room for 18 months, I'll pick the people. Having said that, one thing that is also true is that when you're working in a collaboration, there is always going to be some element of compromise. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. Very often to produce the best possible result. But I can assure you, left to my own devices, I would not have rewritten that Doctor Who script 11 times. Left to my own devices, there are things that you would not do a certain way. You're doing them because you have a collaborator. You're doing them because there are other people you're working with. Even today, with Amanda, we're listening to the recordings we did of this tour, and there was one point where we're just listening to deciding what tracks we were going to use, and I said, well, obviously we're going to cut out this 50 seconds from this thing. And she said, well, no, I think it adds to it. I'm going, well, I don't. And we're batting heads on it. And I knew that if it was just me, it would be gone, and if it was just her, it would be in. And there's a level of any kind of collaboration is going to involve some kinds of disagreement, where there probably isn't a right or a wrong. It's just matters of opinion. And there is normally that point where I've been collaborating long enough where I say, fuck it, and I go off into my room and I write prose on my own. People ask me about why American Gods was so shapeless. And one reason why, it has this giant amorphous shape and 5 or 6 different endings and things like that is because from sort of 1997, 96, 97, 98, and into 99, I was doing a lot of stuff in Hollywood. I wrote Werewolf. I wrote 12 different drafts of a Neverwhere movie that never got made. I wrote Death, the High Cost of Living movies and things. And I was getting really, really irritated with A, people telling me what to do and to rewrite, and B, with stories that had to be told in 124 pages and had to have beginnings and second acts and third acts. And I just went, right, I'm just doing one that's me, and you can all fuck off, and it's mine. And of course, that was great until the book came out, and I would have people phoning me up from Hollywood saying, we love American Gods. And I'd say, that's great. And they'd say, and we want to make a movie. I'd say, that's great too. And they'd say, how? And I'd say, I have no idea.
We've got time for a couple more questions, so we'll go up there.
Basically, you've spoken a lot about the ideas coming to you, confluence and all that. How do you view plot outlines? Does that come into your writing at all?
The very first thing that I ever did, there was a big long-form fiction work, which was Black Orchid, I wrote a really detailed outline for. And then I wrote the story. And felt, through most of it, like somebody doing colour by numbers. I'd already done all the work and laid it out, and now I was just colouring it in. And as time went on, I tend to not outline. I tend to outline less and less. I tend to have ideas of where I'm going, ideas of where I'm beginning, things that I know that I want to do in the middle. But I want to surprise myself. I want to be the first reader. And so what I do now, as an artistic process, tends to be closer to jumping out of a plane and hoping I can knit a parachute before I hit the ground. I do not recommend this to young writers starting out. I think you should probably do an outline. But I almost never outline anymore. Having said that, I normally know where I'm going, and sometimes even if I claim not to know where I'm going, I know on some deeper level. I can reread it, and I obviously knew what I was doing the whole way. I just didn't necessarily want to let myself know.
Thank you.
Do we have time for me to read my
We do.
Okay.
So I was just going to say, very sorry to the people who didn't get to ask their question, but we do have a treat which I hope will make up for the indignity.
So I asked if I could do this, and I asked if I could do this because I wrote this much earlier this year for the Sydney Opera House, when I was fortunate enough to be part of the Australia Day evening that Amanda was doing at Sydney Opera House. And I wrote a poem for it. And I know it's not Australia Day now. However, there are so few places in the world that I could possibly read this poem. And I've never actually read it aloud to anybody since I did it that night at Sydney Opera House. And I thought, and I was thinking tonight, I thought, well, I'd love to just read something and not just talk and answer questions. I thought, I'd love to read something. And then I thought, well, what about that? And I thought, oh, yes, I will read that. So you have to forgive the fact that it's not actually Australia Day. And it doesn't actually have a title. The title is just read at the Sydney Opera House, Australia Day 2011. We killed them all when we came here. The people came and burned their land, the forests where they used to feed. We burned the trees that gave them shade and burned to bush, to scrub, to heath. We made it easier to hunt. We changed the land, and they were gone. Today our beasts and dreams are small as species fall to time and us. But back before the black folk came, before the white folks' fleet arrived, before we built our cities here, before the casual genocide, this was the land where nightmares loped and hopped and ran and crawled and slid. And then we did the things we did, and thus we died, the things we died. We have not seen Diprotodon, a wombat bigger than a room, or run from Dromornithidae, gigantic demon ducks of doom. All motor legs and ripping beaks, a flock of geese from hell's dark moor. We've lost carnivorous kangaroo, a bouncy furrier T-Rex, and Thylacoleo carnifex, the rat king devil lion thing, the drop bear fantasy made flesh. Quincana, the land crocodile, 5 meters long and fast as fright. Wanambi, the enormous snake who waited by the water holes and took the ones who came to drink, who were not watchful, clever, bright. Our thylacines were tiger wolves until we drove them off the map. Then megalania, 7 meters, a venomous, enormous lizard, and more, the ones whose bones we've never seen. The megafauna haunt our dreams. This was their land before mankind, just 50,000 years ago. Time is a beast that eats and eats, gives nothing back but ash and bones. And one day, someone else will come to excavate a heap of stones and wonder, what were people like? Their teeth weren't sharp, their feet were slow. They walked Australia long ago before time took them into tails. We're transients. The land remains until its outlines wash away, while night falls down like drop bears don't, to swallow up Australia Day.
Well, you're already clapping, but happy Australia Day, ladies and gentlemen, Neil Gaiman.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Clem.